Thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome to Toxic Progeny. And as Carrie explained, this is a whole setup, right? There's the queer ecology in the background. There's a workshop. And tonight, we're going to have a conversation. And, you know, there are little presentations in order for us to just sort of lay out some of the terrain that we want to cover with you. But in general, we're going to have a conversation to sort of stage some of the issues that we hope to then engage you in a discussion about. The basic theme tonight is that we are living in a plastic world. Plastic is all around us. It's in the air that we breathe. It's in the water that we drink. It's in you. You are made up of all kinds of microbial level plastic. In other words, plastic pollution is here. It's in the world. It is us. We can't any longer look back to a time without plastic. And as our critics will tell us, we probably can't start thinking about a future in which there is no plastic either. So there is no way out. So the question is, how do we cohabit with the plastic pollution that we've created while recognizing what kind of damage that plastic does to the world? But how do we manage to also think about plastic without falling into a discourse of the authentic versus the artificial? Why would we not want to do that? Well, we would not want to do that because generally speaking, there are populations and people who have been associated with plasticity and artificiality. And so the whole concept of queer ecology is to try to avoid, while talking about pollution, to try to avoid falling back into heteronormative modes of thought in which queerness is the problem that needs to be resolved. Why would it be queerness? Because at least one of the impacts of plastic on the world around us has been to change reproductive capabilities. So there's a decline in fertility for some female-bodied people. There's massive anxiety about sperm count. And there are areas of the scientific community in which there's a kind of panic about what plastic is doing to the categories of male, female, masculine, feminine, and reproductive sexuality itself. So we're going to navigate this terrain carefully and responsibly, thinking about the way in which pollution, to cite one critic, is colonialism, and the way in which pollution is embedded in racial capital, but also to tread carefully around the ways in which we are imbricated in and complicit in the plasticity that we want to disavow. Okay, so that's sort of the trajectory. And I do actually have, and for anyone who doesn't sort of know the vocabulary of queerness, queer theory and queer ecologies and queer ways of thinking presume that there is no natural connection between being human and being heterosexual, and no obvious any longer connection between having sex and reproduction. So that's, you know, there's lots more to say about queer theory and queer ecology, and our speakers tonight will do some of that. But before I hand over to our speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment, I do want to illustrate, using an artifact from popular culture, how aware we all are of the fact that we now live in a plastic world. Right? What was this movie about? It was about a world of PVC beings that was nestled up against our world and sometimes interacted with it and even engaged it, but that was sort of different from us, but also sort of embedded in our world. So we also had humans who could not reproduce. They do not have genitalia, the Kens and the Barbies. Ken is a virtual plastic dildo in this film, and there'll be more on the dildo to come, as you'll see. And of course, when Barbie finally decides that she wants to become human, she has to fall out of the plastic and into reproductive femininity. So many of the concerns, many of the questions, and many of the symbolic formulations that we want to engage tonight are, you know, kind of addressed in this film. Greta Gerwig was a gender studies major at Barnard. I'm not saying that, you know, gender studies is responsible for this film, but the film is both appalling and engaging all at once. And some of the ways in which we're appalled and some of the ways in which we find that the movie appeals to us have to do with plastic. So tonight, we're going to discuss plastic matters and all the ways in which we live with the toxic progeny of plastic pollution. So we're going to hear two presentations to set the stage for our conversation. Our speakers tonight are Heather Davis, and Heather Davis has written an immensely important cultural history, cultural study of plastic called Plastic Matter. It came out from Duke University Press. It is available, and many of the ideas that we're going to address tonight come from this beautiful, groundbreaking work. But our first speaker is an evolutionary biologist from Sweden, Malin Ah-King. She works in feminist science studies. She is the co-author with Ava Hayward of a brilliant essay about the transsex panic in scientific communities around plastic. And she's also written a book called The Female Turn: How Evolutionary Science Shifted Perceptions About Females. So I want to welcome to the stage Malin Ah-King. Thank you.
So I have this one. And thank you. Thank you. So, yes, just as Jack said, what I normally do now is feminist science studies and looking into how evolutionary science have produced knowledge. But today I will be focusing on my earlier work on a dynamic model of sex and how that can help us understand hormone-disruptive pollution. So first, sex in biology, we define it by who is producing the small gametes, the sperm. That one is a male, and the one who's producing big gametes are the females. And sometimes those are in the same individual, and sometimes those are in different individuals. But in practice, biologists often don't look at the egg and the sperm, but they instead look at the appearances of individuals or their genitals in order to try to define who's a male or a female. But there is so much variability in nature. For example, a crocodile's egg is unsexed to begin with, but then it develops into a sex during egg development and depending on the temperature during that egg development. And there are many, many species that can change sex. For example, these clownfishes. And here we see a family tree of fishes in which the sex determination has shifted many, many times. So in some species they have environmental sex determination, in other species they have chromosomes, and those chromosomes are shifting over the whole tree. So my collaborator Søren Nelin and I, we presented a new model of trying to think about sex as dynamic, in contrast to those who define sex as dichotomous and stable. So we started out with this idea of thinking of sex as dynamic with the environment, with this, and one example of that is this unsexed egg of the turtle, which during egg development then, just as in crocodiles, determine the sex of the individual. So they become a female if the temperature is high, and a male if the temperature is low. And we propose this dynamic model of sex from an evolutionary perspective and suggested that we should think of sex as a dynamic process, a responsive potential that may change over an individual's lifetime and in interaction with the environment. There are many different pollutants that may influence our hormones. So hormone-disruptive pollutants, they are in our food, they are in the air we breathe, in the water we drink, and we also produce them as our artificial produced hormones. And as we have come to know more and more about these pollutants, this has come to media attention for a good reason, because these are toxic. However, when my colleague Eva Hayward and I looked into how the reports about these hormone-disruptive pollutants were described, we noticed that there were anxieties around sex and sexuality and gender bending in those reports. For example, this is a picture from the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation that launched a campaign to save the man, because they describe the men as especially vulnerable to this pollution. They also described how phthalates seem to have a special liking for very young boys' genitals. And this illustrates just the problem with hyper-focusing on this sexual anxiety in these campaigns. And we call this the trans-sex panic. So in light of understanding sex as something dynamic and continuously changing, we think that we can develop a deeper understanding of hormone-disruptive pollution and also take the threats of toxicity seriously without reinscribing these cultural fears of changing sex and sexuality. And whilst hormone-disruptive pollution affects the whole world and everyone in it, we need to ask who is most at risk. And this last slide is from a picture from biohacker and artist Mary Magic from an exhibition that engaged in hormone disruption, plastic waste and pollution in Indonesia. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to Carrie, to Meredith, to all the Pioneer Works people. You all have been amazing, and thank you so much to Jack for that lovely introduction, and to both Malin and Jack for their work, without which I wouldn't be able to have done any of my own thinking around plastic. So I wanted to introduce it by sort of starting with the question of why did I become obsessed with plastic, which I did about 10 years ago, and it kind of hasn't let me go, and it probably in the foreseeable future also doesn't seem like it's going to let me go. And I became obsessed with plastic for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm trained as a cultural theorist, I work in the environmental humanities, and I'm really interested in why and how oil and the saturation of fossil fuels has changed our culture. And plastic is one of the most intimate manifestations of how we interact with fossil fuels on a regular basis. And so that was part of my interest, which will become, I think, more apparent as our conversation goes on. And the other interest was more biographical. So the people that you see behind me are my maternal grandparents. And my grandfather was a chemical engineer and later a manager at DuPont for his entire career, his entire life. And he was instrumental in developing and producing all kinds of petrotextiles and other plastic goods. And so one of the things that I really was grappling with when I started thinking about plastic was, what are our relationships of inheritance? What kinds of worlds is plastic building? And what is the kind of legacies of plastic? And how do we maybe disrupt that through rethinking some of the terms and norms from places like feminist and queer theory? So a couple of the ways in which I started thinking through that in relationship to plastic and with this lens of feminist and queer theory was through these different kinds of objects. So this one is a plastaglomerate. It's a type of a rock, and as you can see, it's completely enmeshed. The plastic is completely enmeshed in this rock-like substance. And what it illustrates is the ways in which the synthetic cannot be disentangled from the natural, that the unnatural and the natural are so completely bound up together as to be rendered kind of obsolete or unhelpful categories. And I think that this, again, reflects back to the kinds of theoretical interventions that queer theory is also making. Another insight from plastics that helps to guide my thinking is the ways in which the kind of idea or myth of the sovereign individual is precisely that. It's a myth. And we can see that both in the kinds of interventions that queer and feminist theory make in terms of how we can undo this, this idea that we are bounded organisms. And we can also see that through the influence of petrochemicals that come into our bodies and permeate our bodies, whether we like it or not. The other ways in which I've been thinking through and with plastic is through this idea of toxic progeny. And this idea really came about originally through this image, which is an image of a bunch of different it's a microbial community that exists on floating pieces of plastic in the oceans. And when I first came across this, I was just fascinated by it, and what it helped me to think about was the ways in which all of these bacteria, new forms of communities of bacteria, new forms of microbial life, new forms of fungal life are coming into existence precisely because of the saturation of petrochemicals throughout the world. And so I started thinking about them as a kind of bastard child of advanced capitalism, or as a kind of non-filial human progeny. But I wanted to look at it also in terms of what would a kind of queer or feminist lens add to that kind of understanding. So how might we then, to some degree, think through the senses of obligations towards these creatures? So if we are birthing them, if part of what the saturation of petrochemicals is doing is inhibiting the ability to sexually reproduce, and yet we're birthing these like plentitudes of microbial life, what might it mean to then think about that as a kind of an obligation, a kind of ethical obligation to these creatures, not as a way of like having to necessarily take care of them, but as a kind of a stance of thinking about intergenerational justice. So I'm going to end there and open it up to our conversation.
All right. That was fantastic. Thank you to both of you for sharing your work. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation up here and try to explore some of these ideas, get into the question of what toxic progeny are, and as Heather just proposed, what our relationship to them might be, what our obligations are, but also to think about this transsexing panic that attends some of the news about pollution. But let's start with a slide, just to open things up a little bit. I'm going to show you a slide that actually comes from one of Heather's chapters, and I'm going to let her explain it to you, but just have a look for a second, see what you think. Thank you. All right. Have a look and see if you can understand what you're looking at. A happy fisherman,
Can everyone
a fish, and Heather. Explain this photograph to us.
Yeah, so hopefully people can see clearly But this is a man named Bjorn Freeland. I'm sure you could help with the pronunciation. He's a Norwegian fisherman, and he was, very excited to catch this fish. I think it's a cod, although I could be mistaken. And as he was gutting the fish, he noticed that there was something inside of it in its belly. And as he pulled it out, you'll notice that this is some kind of dildo vibrator sex toy that the fish has consumed, probably because it looks a little bit like the multicolored octopi that this fish likes to normally eat. And instead, the fish has now eaten this sex toy. So one of the ways in which I think about this is what it opens up in terms of this relationship of queer theory and plastic, and thinking through the kinds of relations of the kinds of questions of reproductive futurism that I think both of your work is super engaged with. So how do we think through the kinds of questions of the impending kind of senses of extinction? How do we think through the ways in which plastic is contributing to that? How is plastic both in this sense, both in some ways the strange object of desire, of pleasure, but that has been sort of reincarnated as this slow death for this poor fish, although actually maybe it didn't die of the dildo. I think it just died because it got caught and then it was eaten. But in another version of the story, it could have slowly starved to death because of this plastic in its stomach. For me, it really illustrates the kind of nexus of a lot of the kinds of questions that get opened up when we sort of think about the interrelationship between queer theory and plastic. That is in part also illustrated by a quote from Max Liboran, who says, "What do we do when both the chemical industry and the LGBTQ community says that petrochemicals are queering our bodies?" And they're both sort of in favor of this. This is a kind of strange bedfellow situation that I wanted to continue to explore.
And Malin, do you want to weigh in on exactly that quote about how, this atmosphere of pollution is queering the body? Like, what do we even mean when we say that? And how is that illustrated? I mean, you can or you don't have to refer to the image, but the image is just such a perfect juxtaposition of the so-called natural and the artificial, one of which is associated with a particular, a way of life that we accept, fishing, and the other is associated with a way of life that we do not accept, which is, queer sex or sex with toys. So there's a kind of transsex panic or some kind of queer panic that could be read into this image. As you say, Heather, the fish probably died because the fisherman caught it, not necessarily because of the dildo. We don't know what it was doing with the dildo. But in what ways is plastic pollution and other forms of pollution having an impact that we could call queering on the body?
I think we can think about how these endocrine disruptors, they can either mimic the hormones that we're naturally producing, or it could block them, or it could also steer them in different ways. So in that way, kind of queering our hormone systems, not only the sex hormones, but all our 50 different hormones may be disrupted by these endocrine disruptors.
Yeah, but as you were saying in your presentation, there's so much within species diversity, there's already so much dynamism in the way in which creatures live out their sex lives, right? So, how much of the panic around this transsexing or queering of the body is justified, which is implied in the Max Liboran quote, and how much of it, comes from this sort of right-wing panic that we maybe even could connect to some of the transpanic more generally around the globe?
Yeah, so when we did this study 10 years ago, we saw a lot of this transexpanic in for example, in the environmental movement and in the reports in the media about sex-changing fishes, and we saw that this was something that was highlighted rather than the other kinds of different adverse effects, health effects that these chemicals have. So that's why we describe this as a transexpanic. But of course, these are serious changes. But seeing sex as a reaction norm or as a reactive potential also means that there is potential for this process to reverse and for healing as well.
For healing, meaning?
Healing. And that these toxicities may... So, for example, one of the examples that we took up was in the Potomac River, I think it was, that the fishes that were initially male, they could produce eggs, which means that in this future, we can also see that these fishes may be reproducing still in this other future.
Right, thank you. Well, let's think about reproduction here a little bit. Heather, you showed us images of these microbial and fungal life forms that we're both responsible, I guess, for producing, and that play many different roles in this drama of pollution. And I wanted to return to this idea that we have in the title of our event tonight, that they are our toxic progeny. In other words, we don't only reproduce human life, we're responsible for the reproduction of all kinds of life on the planet, some of which we own, some of which, like Frankenstein's monster, we disown. So tell us about these toxic progeny, what they do, where they came from, and what is our responsibility to them then?
I mean, I think that those are really good questions. I mean, part of my provocation of sort of saying that we should think of them as a kind of queer kin or as a kind of toxic progeny was both built on the ways in which in queer communities we really build, we don't rely upon necessarily the kind of biological kin to be able to really think about who you're responsible to and how to build a life together, what kind of a world you want to build in community with others. And so one of the things that's really important to me about that is also that can also be applied as a kind of ecological value. So that if we're extending our kind of frameworks of what we understand as a family structure beyond who we're biologically related to, there's also no reason why we then couldn't extend that out to other than human creatures. And so part of the impetus was coming from that. And then part of it was also precisely around that kind of question of reproduction. Like, why should reproduction stop at the skin, right? It clearly doesn't, right? Like, we reproduce things all of the time. And there's a couple ways in which, so in a lot of ways, the kind of invitation to think about those creatures as a kind of non-human kin is really about, like, what is our sense of obligation to the worlds that we're creating, even if we're not directly related to them? I think there's so much a kind of a disavowal of the ways in which we're reproducing particular types of worlds for particular types of people. And especially, in your work, you show it in relationship to the kind of Save the Man campaign. But in environmental literatures in general, especially in mainstream environmentalism, there's a real sense of, like, we have to save the planet for the children. And often in that, it's not really meant as, at least you can read it in one particular way, which is like, it's not that it's meant we're saving the planet for the actual people who are actually going to be born and then are actually going to have to live in the mess that previous generations have created, but it feels more like it's a reproduction of a certain way of life. So a particular kind of heteronormative, white, capitalist life, right? And that this is the thing that we're reproducing and trying to hold on to. And so what if we gave up that fantasy, right? Like, what if we gave up that fantasy of that type of a child, that type of a figure, and instead turned our attention to these microbial relations? What would that mean in terms of how would we orient ourselves ethically and politically in the world? And so it's not so much that I had a certain sense of a prescriptive end to it, but I wanted to open up these sets of questions to highlight the kinds of investments that we currently have and the types of investments that might be possible if we looked to queer and feminist theory and to anti-colonial theories to really rethink our relationship to a material like plastic.
Well, let's go back to that Save the Man campaign. I mean, because wow, I mean, we know that men are an endangered species, and I'm sure there are all kinds of campaigns ongoing to save that man. So maybe tell us a little bit about what's behind that, and then let's think about what these alternative futures would look like that were not routed through the white heteronormative family. Do we catch a glimpse of those in these other toxic progeny that we're, living in the world alongside?
Yeah, so it was interesting when you read this campaign and how they describe the reduction in sperm counts, but then they also describe that those who are most, who tolerate those toxins the least are the young children and the women who are pregnant. So, but they still put up the man as the one who needed to save.
So he had to be saved because he had the low sperm count, but the actual impact of pollution is most harshly felt by women and children.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, here we can see this sort of underlying heteronormative script that is writing a whole narrative about pollution that doesn't seem to be about heterosexuality at all, and yet is entirely driven by narratives about the family, about men and women being men and women, and so on. One of the really scary qualities of plastic, which was a feature at least in the Barbie movie, is that it doesn't biodegrade, right? So the temporality of plastic is really, really different from human temporality and from organic temporalities of organic materials that do biodegrade. So how do we reckon with this absolutely infinite future that plasticity is inscribing on our world, and yet our sort of finite temporality within it? How can we think about temporality in relationship to pollution? And are there queer ways of thinking about that?
I mean, I think that a couple of things that I would say is that some of these bacteria and fungus can successfully eat plastic. And it's a little bit, most of them seem like they can actually get some kind of nutritional quality out of it. But in some cases, it's a little unclear in the scientific literature if they're just kind of consuming it and immediately expelling it. And it then has this kind of a net effect of reducing the plastic, but it's not quite sure if the organism is really benefiting from this. But I can say from a home experiment involving mealworms, which I do not necessarily recommend, but you can try it at home if you want to, where you can get just some mealworms from Amazon. They will arrive in the mail, which is kind of a weird enough experience to begin with. And then once they arrive, you can put them in a little container with some styrofoam, and they will happily live through multiple cycles and multiple generations in the little container, and they just live off of styrofoam, presumably in a kind of infinite cycle. So I think that like one of the things that for me is really fascinating about plastic and its relationship to temporality is both the ways in which it kind of represents, in some sense, it's really pushing evolution in particular kinds of directions, because I doubt that, I mean, obviously these creatures wouldn't be developing the capacity to successfully biodegrade plastics in their guts if it weren't for the kind of widespread use of plastics. And so one of the things that it's really identifying is the kind of evolutionary time of fossil fuels, and really it has that kind of a temporality to it. And then in other circumstances, as you rightly point out, it's like plastics will exist for an indefinitely long period of time, and no one really knows. And I think that for me, when I'm trying to think through those questions of like, how do we think through the question of temporality in relationship to plastic, I think that in some ways it has this kind of mechanism of certain kind of, almost like a path dependency that it creates, so that even if we stop producing it now, as you were saying, we're going to have to live with it. People are going to have to live with it. The other animals and organisms on this earth are going to have to live with it for an indefinite period of time into the future. And I'm curious about that. I'm curious about what that means in terms of kind of questions of how do we think through questions of queer futurities in that space? How would we might orient ourselves to the kind of endless repetition of the present that seems to be implied in plastic. I mean, one of the things, this isn't totally related to your question, but I wanted to say it before I forgot, which is that one of the things that I ran across in my research was when I went down to DuPont has a set of archives that's open to the public in Wilmington, and you can go down there, and in those archives, I ran across this really potent story of a plastics engineer who worked for the plastics department of DuPont, and he described the ways in which, when you drove into the town that he was working in, there'd be this overwhelming chemical smell that would just kind of hit you as you drove into the town. And everyone in the town at the time, this is, you know, the 1950s or so, 1960s, and everyone in the town described this as the smell of progress. And I think that this is such an illustrative point in relationship to the type of temporality that plastic occupies, that it occupies this temporality of progress, it occupies this temporality where even if we call it progress, in some sense what we're doing is doing that same kind of move where we're reproducing our current way of life sort of along these lines into the future. And yet, you know, even as I'm saying that, I'm thinking of the plastiglomerate as it is moving into the earth and inhabiting entirely different types of temporalities.
Yeah, in your book you say that plastic exists outside of the proper logics of decay and transformation. And I was really taken with that idea that there are now bacteria and I guess microbial forms that can actually live off the plastic. And even though it's not biodegrading, but it can be consumed by something. And I wanted to hear more about that, whether is that being, you know, considered as a reasonable way to manage plastic pollution, to create more of this bacteria, and then are there worries about that bacteria then taking on some other kind of lively form that could be toxic in other ways? I mean, how do we often are not thinking about these micro-level organisms that we live alongside, but they are as important as, you know, the dogs and the cats that we're endlessly tending to. So what about these bacterial others that are, and Malin, I was wondering in evolutionary biology if there's any discussion of these lively bacteria.
Yes, shall I start? Yes. I mean, we know so much about bacteria now that we are inhabiting a lot of bacteria. For every human cell we carry 10 other bacteria. So we're actually ecosystem walking on two legs. And these bacteria have the possibility of kind of degrading a lot of things from uranium to crude oil. And I mean, even before plastics, there were oil and tar, and bacteria actually evolved to to use the kind of resources that are out there. So that's not surprising.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that those bacterial life forms are completely fascinating in terms of like the kinds of things that they can produce, and in terms of like thinking about are they being used, they certainly are. Like there's a particular type of bacteria, I'm forgetting the name of it, but that don't have the most charismatic names. I think they should be renamed like with more fun names, and then that'd be easier to remember. But there's a particular type of bacteria that was that developed spontaneously in a Japanese dump, and was found by researchers, and it is being used to try to biodegrade plastics as a form of actual recycling, because the systems that we have for recycling plastic are completely and utterly inadequate and really don't work for most forms of plastic, and plastics can usually only be recycled once before they have to be upcycled. So it actually would produce this kind of sense of, if not, recycling in the kind of true sense where it gets put back into its original molecular components rather than as the base substance for producing plastic again. But there's also like a great science fiction book, I think called Mutant 95, which imagines what would happen if these bacteria, this type of bacteria that's evolving and that scientists are working with to try to deal with plastic waste, what would happen if that escaped out of the lab? And it's a hilarious book about, airplanes falling from the sky, and everyone all of a sudden is walking around naked, and all of these things. I guess people's sex toys would just disintegrate spontaneously, unless you buy the silicone ones, and so it's this kind of hilarious take on really kind of showing us how much plastic is in our world and how much we really depend upon it, and rethinking our relationship to bacteria as a kind of, maybe strange kind of, almost like a ploy of kind of like ecological terrorism or something to take down capitalism as we currently know it.
I mean, usually when these weird forms appear in sci-fi, they're sort of zombified forms of life. I was thinking about Last of Us, where mushrooms, which it turns out mushrooms are, fungal entities, are amazingly adaptive entities that are able to survive in often blasted landscapes where nothing else can survive, but we tend to treat them as an enemy to the human. And I want to eventually get to a question about what is the human in this vastly shifting, changing world. But before we get there, we'll sort of move slowly towards this morphing human. But we've cited Max Libéron's book a couple of times, Colonialism is Pollution, which is an amazing book from an indigenous scholar who works in a science lab, I think in Newfoundland, and thinks about the way that settler colonialism is a sort of starting point for these relationships to pollution, and that before there's pollution, there's a land grab, and there's a division of the world into territories and communities that must be maintained as pristine, and territories and communities that are disposable and can be used as dumping sites. And I wanted to ask both of you about this legacy. We're talking about legacies of pollution, futurities of pollution. I wanted to ask you to both talk a little bit about racial and colonial legacies and realities in relationship to polluted environments and the flow of pollution.
Yeah.
I know you have some examples,
yes,
Malin.
from Sweden we have some examples. It's not especially connected to plastics, but we have an indigenous people in Sweden, the Samis, and the Swedes are usually thinking about themselves as being very innocent when it comes to colonialism. We were not a big colonial country, even though we did have a colonial island called Saint Bartholomew, which we used for slave trade. But the continuous colonialism in Sweden today has to do with the Sami people and how the Swedes still have not taken these ratifications of the describing them as an indigenous people, and also giving out mining companies the possibility to make mines in the reindeer countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a similar process, although different because of the different historical realities that go into the continent of North America, happens here, both in Canada and the United States. And certainly Max's work has been really influential in terms of my own thinking about how do we think through the kinds of legacies of plastic. And obviously there's sort of, realities of the fact that, like the factory that I showed earlier, which is a petrochemical factory, is located in Amjawang, which is an Anishinaabe nation in the southern Ontario, and it's the concentration of petrochemical factories in Canada. In a similar process, there's also the concentration of petrochemical factories in Louisiana, in the United States. And in both of these places, it's because of the kind of racialized communities that are being completely kind of displaced through the mechanisms of pollution. And in the case of Amjawang, if you're a land-based people who are trying to maintain a particular ways of governance and have particular senses of obligation to particular plants and animals, that is being radically disrupted through these petrochemical industries. And there's also just completely inadequate systems of notifying people in relationship to what is happening there, in terms of when the factories release harmful chemicals into the air. There's huge amounts of health disparities of cancers and other kinds of health concerns in this community, including also the fact that within the community there's a huge sex ratio discrepancy where there's 4 female children born to every 1 male child. And lots of people have done really interesting and super important work around this, including Murphy, a scholar in science and technology studies based at the University of Toronto. But in the United States context and in Louisiana, primarily this is affecting obviously Indigenous communities as well, and poor communities sort of all over the country, but including a lot of Black communities, and especially in Louisiana, a lot of communities that historically were free Black communities. So people who had managed to figure out ways of escaping slavery, build communities in the 1700s, which seems, kind of phenomenal and totally unlikely, and then through the encroachment of various kinds of petrochemical companies, including a company by the name of Sasol, which is a South African company, and other companies that are affecting all kinds of communities in southern Louisiana, including a community in St. James. Some of these communities are actually being forced to leave. So one of the towns that I write about in the book, that is a town where one of my colleagues, her family is from, is the town of Mossville, and that town has literally been bought out by petrochemical companies because it's so toxic to live there that instead of actually dealing with any of the kind of toxic emissions of the petrochemical factories, it's easier to just ask people to leave, to buy them out and ask people to leave. But of course this is the kind of the same type of logic of enforcing a kind of plastic being onto people. So people are kind of constantly being asked, especially in the cases of Black folks, and other theorists have written about this, like Zakiya Jackson, who've really talked about the ways in which any kind of attempt to make a home is being radically undermined through these processes of the encroachment of petrochemicals and other forms of pollution. But in addition to that people are just expected to be infinitely malleable. People are expected to be infinitely adaptable. People are expected to be infinitely plastic in that metaphorical sense, but also in some ways in a really literal, embodied sense. And so these are all the ways in which plastics are embedded with a kind of logic of settler colonialism, I think, from the very beginning.
So in other words, there's, separate from the actual material entity of plastic, there are discourses about plasticity that we're grappling with. Like how much plasticity is available in the human organism over time. It does, as we were talking about, we do evolve. There are shifts and changes. But as you're saying, Heather, plasticity as an attribute of the body is unevenly distributed across populations, and sometimes it's used to suggest that, in racial ways almost, that certain communities are extremely adaptable, and at other times it's used to justify pollution in the ways that you're suggesting. So, I'm wondering, like in evolutionary biology, how do people talk about plasticity rather than just plastic? And how does that sort of then enter into some of these conversations we're having about transsexing and panics? It's a big question.
Yes, that's a very big question. But maybe this is a time when I should talk about the fast and slow evolution.
Yeah.
So we talked about how bacteria has a possibility of changing very, very quickly, and that bacteria can also, once they have gained, for example, resistance towards antibiotics, they can also, when they come in contact with other bacteria, they can actually transfer that. So there is horizontal transfer between the bacteria, and in that way we can very quickly get a lot of bacteria that are resistant to the kind of medicines that we have. So that's a way that evolution is very quick. And on the other hand, evolution can be very slow, as some things are conserved. We call it conserved. For example, how the receptor for estrogen is similar in many, many different animals. So in that way, since that is conserved, a pollution that would kind of mimic estrogen or block estrogen would have a very big effect on many, many different animals. So.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking, Heather, while you were speaking about, and this is more of an academic question, hopefully not too much in the weeds, but just how all of these discourses are sort of at odds with each other in some ways. Like, on the one hand, we want to talk about a queer ecology in which plasticity has capacity and capabilities and is our hideous queer kin and so on. But then, on the other hand, there are questions about the relationship to the land and stewardship over the land and creatures that have a completely different orientation. So how do we make sense of the different kinds of commitments that queer ecology, feminist ecology, anti-pollution groups, indigenous ecology may have? How can that be part of our conversation?
I mean, I think that there's like the blunt answer, which is that clearly the kind of massive production of plastics, and specifically the kinds of incredibly toxic forms of plastics like PVC that the Barbies are made of, should kind of just stop existing. Like there's no reason for us to continue manufacturing that type of plastic. There's all kinds of ways in which people have been very helpful on a kind of policy level to sort of say that we need to streamline the kinds of plastics that we're producing to make them less toxic, to make them less dependent on the kinds of phthalates and plasticizers that get added to plastics. But in some ways, in terms of my own thinking about the kinds of questions of plasticity or the different kinds of arguments around it, I don't know if I think part of my interest is not necessarily always resolving those tensions, and actually just kind of letting them live in a way that there's a certain kind of contradiction there that maybe has to be worked out in more particular situations, or maybe has to be worked out in more kinds of specific iterations. And I also think that there's something valuable about having things bump up against each other that don't get resolved. I think that this is maybe something that I've taken from a kind of feminist or queer ethic, which doesn't necessarily mean that we can't have political programs about what to do about plastic, or we can't have policy initiatives, or we can't try to shut down these petrochemical factories. That's not at all what I mean. And we could certainly do all of those things. But I think that there's also something about the kinds of tensions that plastic allows us to see that moves far beyond just plastic in particular as a material, and shows us maybe some of the places where we align and no longer align in terms of particular kinds of political agendas that I think are useful in being left unresolved.
Yeah, I like the irresolution. I'm almost tempted to wind down there, but let's just finish out with maybe a question about the human living in this plastic world. And I was thinking a little bit about Donna Haraway's work when both of you were speaking, and about the sort of uneasy truce that she allowed between technology and the body, using the figure of the cyborg. And she suggested, instead of just fighting technology all the time, we should realize that we're actually already technology. Technology isn't out there and then we are human. We are cyborgs already. And there's some element of that in the discussion that we're having tonight, that we can't reverse the pollution that we've already, the pollution processes that we've set in motion. We can't reverse them. We can't imagine a future beyond them. But at the same time then, what we mean by the human is shifting and changing radically. That's what creates this panic among the people who are Save the Man activists, is this sense that something irreversible is changing in the human. And of course the plastic has always been seen as the opposite of the human. So what does it mean now that the plastic is to be enfolded into our definition of the human? Can we identify, are there any obvious ways in which we can think about how the human changes under those conditions, for better or for worse?
I can go. A couple of things that question makes me think of is that when Haraway's talking about the cyborg, she also says this thing that just always delights me, which is that cyborgs are never, they don't have any fidelity to their fathers. And so I think a lot about this in relationship to that kind of bacteria, or also like how we might take certain ideas of queer and feminist life forward. And in some ways, I think I see what she's saying as being like, okay, so all of this might have emerged from these implications of war technologies, capitalist technologies, colonial technologies, but there is this possibility for rethinking what we could mean to each other under these pressures, these intense pressures of climate change, of the saturation of petrochemicals, of all of this stuff. And I think in a lot of ways, one of the reasons why I love sort of working and teaching queer ecologies is because I think when you look to, there's more of an openness now, I think, to really rethink the human in relationship to the other beings that we co-occupy the planet with. And, as you were saying, we could think of ourselves as ecosystems rather than as individuals. And we could also think of ourselves as really, really kind of radically implicated with the world around us, and I think in both good and bad ways. But I think that one of the things that really happens is that, the only reason why petrochemicals make sense or plastic pollution would make sense to anybody, especially as a kind of utopian project or an idea of progress, is because you would think that it's not going to affect you, right? Like we would never be saturating the world in this stuff if we really took seriously our kind of radical relations with the rest of the world, with the rest of the environment, with the rest of the beings. And I think that to me, the kind of shift in that direction, kind of in some sense, in a lot of ways, really undoing what we've thought of as the human, and also the ways in which the figure of the human has been so tied to the figure of man, the figure of the white, male, propertied, colonial subject, that where so many of us have never been human to begin with, and maybe we don't want to be, right? Maybe we want to be ecosystems instead.
What do you think, Malin? Do we want to be human, or we want to be queer kin?
Yes, we want to be queer kin. I would like to bounce the question back to you, because you've been writing about this living dead and zombies.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been writing about exactly the way in which we're already living with all kinds of creatures that have extremely ambivalent relationships to life and death, and that we then call zombified and put them over here, when in fact we ourselves are zombified at work, or zombified in relationship to social media, or we're in fact always in these partial relationships to life and death. I can't believe you steered us to the zombie. That was very clever. All right, I'll talk to her later. So I actually think this is, we have a great audience here who hopefully have been able to interact with the queer ecologists in the back, and are looking forward to the Merry Magic workshop. So this is a good time for you to prep for those things by asking questions to Malin and Heather. And I believe there's somebody going around with a microphone, and you can come up to the mic. Yeah. Make the long walk. There we go.
Okay, hi. Thanks for the talk. I thought it was really great. I wanted to ask the question of, or if maybe I could prompt you to talk a little bit more about the definition of toxicity, of poison. I think it's a matter of like dosage and time, maybe. But as you were talking, I was just thinking about how like totally unnovel this is in a way. I was thinking about the great oxygenation event, right? Which is like, there was this moment where photosynthesis was just invented, and all these cyanobacteria started pumping oxygen into the earth, and all the anaerobic bacteria were totally poisoned, and they all died. So oxygen was totally a poison at one point, and now we're the progeny of that. So complicates things. Thanks.
Yeah, so toxicity has always been part of life on Earth, and the first life on Earth was actually in a very, very toxic environment. So this is not something new that we have, but we're actually moving into a much more toxic world in a very quick manner now. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that I would say about that, I hope I'm not making too many references, but Mel Chen's work really speaks to this as well, which is that toxins are also the things that we love, right? Like, it's really fun to take toxic, drugs or alcohol or whatever, right? And so, like and kind of altered states that arise because of toxicity, even if it's not intentional, I think can really open up different ways of thinking and being in the world that aren't, even if they aren't good, I think that they can open up other forms of interacting with the world in which we live in. So I think that toxicity has always had that kind of, pharmacon-like relationship where it's not necessarily bad, right? Like in that kind of normative sense, it's much more of an ambiguous state than that. I think it is really deeply implicated in the kinds of questions in life and death, and for whom and under what conditions, and what kinds of affordances are made possible by particular kinds of toxins.
Hi, thank you guys very much. I really appreciated you introducing this much more positive lens. Generally, thinking of like Toxic Archipelago, Brett Walker's book, it's much more about how our bodies are porous and threatened by all these new developments, not thinking so much about the positives, the way that Heather mentioned, but thinking also about the porousness of our body to clean progeny and the sort of double movement of responses to insulate our bodies from these threats to ourselves that we've created. In the future, when we have, perhaps much more sort of invasive solutions to counter these that involve, biopower that is under our skin or is more invasive in ways that are biological modifications, and perhaps even through that psychological modification. I guess one of the things I wanted to ask is thinking about the future of clean progeny from a queer lens that I really appreciate you introducing. How should we as queer people and queer theorists think about the future of individuality as we become more porous to the solutions of clean progeny, responding to this and other human-created threats?
That's an interesting question. The thing that it's making me think of is that movie Safe by Todd Haynes, right? Where the main character increasingly tries to get into cleaner and cleaner and cleaner environments, as she does so, she is kind of falling apart psychologically, and those environments become like her tolerance for dealing with anything that isn't totally pure, totally safe, becomes lower and lower. So it's like the more she's pursuing any sense of safety, the more she's completely falling apart. And I think that to some degree, I think that is precisely the world that we've created, right? That plastics are really built to try to stave off death and decay, to keep us in this kind of clean, sanitized world, right? Like that's literally what they're for in so many of our kind of everyday consumer uses of them. And yet what they've created instead is this kind of widespread toxicity that is obviously differentially felt, as we were trying to highlight, but at the same time is really like none of us, the fantasy of the barricade, the fantasy of being able to stave that off is precisely that. It's precisely a fantasy that in fact is threatening kind of our existences. So I don't know if I've really answered your question, but that's what it made me think of.
I can add that we can't live in a very clean environment. I mean, we need some symbiosis with the bacteria that we're living with. So that's what we do when we take antibiotics. We don't feel as good as we did before. So in order to have a good functioning ecological system, either in our guts or in an aquarium or in an ecosystem, we need a diversity of bacteria that are living together.
But also in Safe, that was such a good example because her environmental allergy drives her further and further away from community. It's impossible for her to be around anyone. Somebody might have a perfume or have washed their clothes or something. And so it reminds us that there's no choice but to live with each other's dirt and germs. And as COVID reminded us, that we are constantly sort of exchanging molecules of material, some of which are good for us and some of which are not. And the effort to try to segregate is disastrous.
Hi, my name is Mimi. So we spent some time talking about the evolutionary potential of fungi and bacterium. this is a question for everybody, but I really do want to hear from Jack as well about what that consumption of plastics, our proximity to plastics means for our human futures.
Well, we definitely don't want to use the category of transhuman, which means something different than the transgender human, right? Because the transhuman are these people like Elon Musk who believe that they can live forever, and they're waiting for something called the singularity, at which point they will be able to swap out all of their aging genes and have a whole new set of genes to live off into the future. And so I know maybe you didn't mean transhuman in that way, but that's certainly the kind of futurity that people who want this kind of, complete separation from decay and from the materiality of being, that's what you end up with. So I think the queer emphasis here is, as one of the early questioners said, to make peace with some of the polluting aspects of life, as opposed to being committed to that separation of the dirty from the pure or the clean. Yeah, I gotcha.
Hi there. I want to thank you guys for all the information that you have been imparting tonight. Heather, I am actually a new school student in the department that you teach in, but I am focusing in media studies, so this is going to be a very media studies question. But while you guys were talking, I couldn't help but think about a recent movie, which was David Cronenberg's Crimes of the Future. And I wanted to talk about the way that this plasticity and the role of queerness and gender relates to the kind of the monstrous, the otherworldly in like horror and sci-fi, and how you feel that this all intertwines and fits in the kind of narrative that is built.
I think that film is fascinating. I love the kind of body horror of it. I love the weird reliance on these plastic-eating people. I think that the kind of line between a kind of the pushing to a certain kind of extreme of both. I think in some sense almost like this transhuman that Jack was just referring to, and at the same time a kind of S&M culture, I think is fascinating, right? I think that it's a kind of really rich, interesting cultural object. At the same time, there's also something always about his films that's so patriarchal that I wish it could be like pushed further in terms of its queer investments, in terms of its feminist investments. Maybe for those of you who I don't even know how to summarize the film. I was going to try, and then I was like, I haven't seen that
one. I actually haven't seen that one, but of course Cronenberg's films are always interested in these mutations that the human is undergoing in relationship to a fly or in relationship to pieces of technology, the videotape, for example. And in the process, the way in which the body, sometimes the male body really opens up in Cronenberg films.
That is true.
Yeah,
That's
putting the videotape into the torso and vaginas opening up under arms and so on. But I agree with you that ultimately it serves a kind of patriarchal, fetishistic imaginary. Yeah. Nothing wrong with that, sometimes, in horror film maybe. All right, let's take, we have about 4 or 5 minutes left, so should we take a couple of questions, do you think? Yeah.
A year or two ago, there was a book that came out called Countdown by Shanna Swan. She's an environmental and reproductive epidemiologist here in New York. And in it, she says that sperm counts have dropped almost 60% since 1973, and that following the trajectory we're on, her research suggests that sperm counts could reach 0 by 2045. So when I remember reading that when that came out, and my response was panic. And I know that we talked about, panic and that being like a problematic response. But what do you make of this book? And what do you make of that prediction? And what are we to make of that scenario if it were to come true? Thank you.
I haven't read that specific book, but I understand that we can, and I think I'm also panicked about, the kind of world we're living in and what the future seems to be. But I just don't think that we should kind of highlight those specific reproductive fears onto, but the whole climate change and it is really scary.
Yeah, but your point, Malin, was we're so focused on sperm count. There are a lot of other areas to be concerned about, rising cancer rates and so on. The idea that sperm count will fall to 0 in this particular year, that's a kind of panic scenario. Who even knows if it's likely, but what it does is it can distract, that kind of data can distract from really alarming data about pollution and cancer rates in certain neighborhoods now, as opposed to this fixed point, 2024, this will happen. That's exactly the narrative of panic, in fact, of the kind of panic we were discussing.
Yeah, and I would just add to that one of the things that I think that the entire, so much of queer theory is really addressing to, including in Jack's work, is this how, what would it mean if we gave up that as the vision of the future, right? What would it mean if we gave up the model of biologically reproducing as the vision of the future? What might that open up in terms of forming relationships with other people, with other beings, with a kind of intergenerational justice that wasn't just so concerned with that particular model of futurity?
So, hi, sorry. I have a question that's kind of more on the theoretical lens, but it seems like this has tipped the scales a bit, and plastic has become some kind of symbolic of the Anthropocene. So we could follow the same logic for nuclear particles, carbon, these types of things. And if we are to think that plastic is habiting with us, it's a co-biological entity. What does this mean in reference to, for instance, Reza Negasrani's concept of the conservative human? That conservative humanism is when we are unable to think about life beyond the horizon of the cyborg, right? And the cyborg now is plastic, is what you're saying, if I understand it. But that there's a typology that follows this. So there's a typology in the global south where multinational corporations are more likely to ravage the land and create higher cancer rates, and microplastics as being a symbol of that. What are we to make of this, negative and positive typology,
Do you want to maybe, that's a pretty nice question to...
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, to stop at.
So yeah, how do we make sense of all of this together? Because it seems like we're taking in a lot tonight, basically.
Thank you, that's great.
As Jack was saying, this is kind of a huge question, and Reza Negasrani is not somebody that I deeply engage with. So, but what I would say is that in Donna Haraway's configuration of how she's thinking about the cyborg, how the cyborg comes about, it is definitely about our implications with technology, but it's also about the emergence of neoliberalism, right? It's also about the emergence of what she calls feminized labor, which is what we could now think of as, the ways in which, Uber has changed the landscape of labor, the ways in which Airbnb has changed the landscape of property, right? All of these kinds of things is precisely what she was really concerned about. And she was specifically engaging with questions of what she called at the time third world feminism, which, now we would say is feminism coming from Black women, from Latinx, from Asian folks. And so I think that like what is really important in that, for me, I think, is that it's deeply invested in a certain kind of politic, right? And is deeply invested in a politic of a kind of a feminism that is attentive to the radical disparities in terms of racial configuration. It's really deeply invested in the ways in which labor is practiced and the kinds of things that is followed out from. And I think that your provocation to sort of think about what would it mean to think about the nuclear fallout in relationship to these questions, or what would it mean to think about other kinds of symbols? I mean, I'd be actually very curious, what would that mean? If you really closely followed nuclear fallout, what kinds of things might be learned from that, or what would be opened up by that? And I wonder if it would be the same as plastics. I don't actually know from this vantage point, but I just want to highlight the ways in which the cyborg is not just a kind of figure of this relationship of technology, but is really a figure that's so much concerned with aligning itself with women of color feminism.
Thank you, Matthew. And it looks like there's one last question.
Sorry, I just came here during the Q&A. I meant to come here, but the night got away from me.
You just arrived during the Q&A.
Yes.
All right.
Okay,
I'm going to give you a couple of words. Let's see where this is going. Yeah.
All right. So I'm a teacher, and I talk about my students a lot about ingesting plastics. And again, if you already talked about this, I'm really sorry. But how would you talk to children? Because I'm just looking to you for the answer right now. When they ask me these questions about what they're ingesting and everything, and I have no answer. And how would you talk to children about ingesting plastics? And it seems like this might not be the right...
We show them this slide and say...
Oh, go on.
Don't
Awesome.
eat your parents' sex toys, basically.
Awesome.
Now, does that... advice for the children? No, it's a reasonable question.
No, it is. It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, I think for me, one of the things that's really important in thinking about maybe plastic activism, which is maybe a kind of easier way to talk about to children about this, is that when we're thinking about what we want to do with plastic, for example, or if we're really concerned about plastic, I think that in so many ways we're asked to deal with plastic. And this is totally inadequate to talk to children about, actually. As I'm saying this, I'm like, what kind of child is this that I'm talking to? I don't even know. It's like a 20-year-old college student. Anyway, but to sort of say, if you really care about this, there are activist organizations that you can get involved with, even as children, right? And and children can go around, just as this kind of Fridays for Futures or various other kinds of climate activists have gotten involved in rethinking what it might mean for children to want to recompose the world. And and then wouldn't it be kind of amazing if there was a bunch of children blocking the manufacture of new plastics buildings? Of course, their parents probably would never allow them to do that, but wouldn't that be useful as a kind of activist strategy? These are terrible suggestions, I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you to everybody involved in tonight's program. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Pioneer Works. And thank you most of all to our two speakers, Heather Davis and Malin Ah-King. Thank you all for coming.